Okay, great. Thanks, Becca. Right, well, we'll make a start then. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. Clearly, you've not had enough horror for one day, so that's brilliant. Thank you for that. It's very commendable. So this is the launch event for the new Abject from Comma Press. The event's in association with Northern Short Story Festival. The book's been edited by Ra Page and Sarah Eyre. It's available now in paperback and ebook. Yeah, just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. My name's Andy Murray. I'm a writer and journalist. I've been involved with Comma on many events over the years. What we're going to do is, you should have come in muted. So if you don't mind keeping yourself muted for this event. And if you have any questions, hopefully by the end of the hour, we should have some time to take questions from you. So any questions that you've got, if you just put them in the chat there at the bottom, and we'll keep an eye on that and come back to it towards the end of the event. The event's being recorded. I hope that's okay with everybody. So just to introduce our guests, we have 3 guests, each of whom has contributed a new story to this new book. First of all, we have Lucie McKnight-Hardy, who has been widely published in many publications with her fiction, including Black Static and Best British Short Stories 2019. Her debut novel, Water Shall Refuse Them, was published by Dead Ink Books last year to much acclaim. And she has a short story collection, Dead Relatives, which I think is due to be published next year.
That's right, yeah.
And we're waiting. We also have with us Ramsey Campbell, described by the Oxford Companion to English Literature as no less than Britain's most respected living horror writer. He's been given more awards than any other writer in the field, and he's written many stories and novels over the years, far too many to even list in an event that only lasts an hour. But his latest novel, I think this is right, Ramsey, was published by Flame Tree Press in April, The Wise Friend. And his stories have been widely anthologized, most recently by Flame Tree and PS Publishing. No more latecomers. And finally, Matthew Holness. Matthew first made his name as Garth Marenghi in the TV show Dark Place, sort of using horror tropes and sort of satirizing them and playing with them. And he's moved on to explore horror in his own way as a writer and director, including contributions to all 3, I think, of Comma's modern horror anthologies, including probably most notably Possum for the New Uncanny, which he then adapted as a feature film in 2018 as writer and director. So that's our 3 guests. We should also probably introduce the notion of the abject. So all 3 of Comma's books have used this notion of putting to the authors an idea or a notion or a theory and asking them to consider this theory and respond to it in their fiction. So this particular theory, the abject, was first introduced by Julia Kristeva in her book Powers of Horror in 1980. There's basically a psychoanalytical notion that we are, as humans, repulsed by things which we have discarded. So in terms of the physical abject, things like fingernails and hair and teeth, things that we've discarded then repulse us and discomfort us. I think this is all supposed to hark back to the notion that when our umbilical cord is cut and we are separated from our mother, that's a horror that we never quite recover from. So Ra Page, co-editor of the book, explains in his introduction, the horror, disgust and recoil we experience when we are faced with what we have shed, let go, expelled, sloughed off, that is the fear of the abject. There's also another aspect of the abject, or another sort of version of it, which was first explored by George Bataille in a 1934 essay called Abjection and Miserable Forms. Rather than the sort of personal abject, the idea is that it's people, so things and people that society expels. It's the idea that we are repulsed by outsiders, outcasts and rebels. So the writers were offered this theory and asked to respond to it in fiction. So to start off with, I was just going to go around and ask everybody if they wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about their story and maybe whether they were aware of the new Abject, or the Abject or other, before they got involved in the project. So Lucie, could you tell us a little bit about your story?
Yes, I'd probably say that I was aware of the concepts and Julia Kristeva's theories around the Abject, rather than being that familiar with them. So Ra provided a really good brief, and I dipped into the essay so that I had enough information to work as a jumping off point for my story. I kind of wanted to approach it from the perspective of social abjection, rather than the kind of body horror aspect. So I had this notion that there existed something called abject art. So I ended up going down a bit of a Google rabbit hole with that. But one of the kind of recurring themes of that was the idea of masks, which feature quite heavily, quite strongly in my story. And there's quite a few artists who use them as, I suppose, imagery within their art. One of whom is Mark Quinn, he's done an amazing series of masks based on casts of his own face. And every 5 years he takes a new cast. And during that time, he saves up enough blood to freeze within the cast to make a mask of his face. And that really appealed to me, because not only do we have the blood from Kristeva's side of this abjection, the bodily abjection, but also the mask is almost like kind of literally there between the self and the other, between the subject and the object. So I thought that was quite a nice motif to use in a story. So for those who haven't read my story, it's probably not many have, because it was only published last week, but it is set in a near future. Well, I suppose it is a dystopia, but as things go on in the world, it's becoming less dystopian and more reality, I think. I wrote the first draft of the story back in January, when things were obviously very different. We weren't used to face masks on a daily basis, and we weren't used to, well, I suppose we were increasingly getting used to a more domineering and totalitarian government, as we've obviously woken up to the potential of today. So that was really my starting point for the story. And so it deals with social abjection, the othering of parts of society that are maybe distasteful to the ruling classes.
Great. Ramsey, to ask you the same question, can you just tell us a bit about your story and whether you were familiar with the Abject as a theory?
Yes, well, in a general sort of way, I've not, in fact, read the essay, but I certainly, had known about it for some time. And to be honest, I've thought for a long time that it relates to a lot of my stuff, basically. That in my stories, the other, the monster, however you want to define it, tends to be something more often than not that the protagonist has denied or repressed or rejected about themselves, with which they're eventually confronted. And then this is certainly true of this particular story, which has something in common with Lucie's story, I have to say, which I did read and I thought extraordinarily powerful, may I say, Lucie. Same for Matthew's too, I may say as well. Mine is again, it's the social abjection in a different form. It's from the viewpoint of an old, not altogether unlike the author himself, I suppose, who becomes obsessed with a father and his two young and very young sons who live in the apartment opposite, and who are basically social outcasts, and also behave, the father in particular, behaving in ways that our protagonist finds reprehensible, about which he tries to do something. But without going into too much detail, it's clearly an aspect of himself in some way that he has forgotten about and hence denied, and eventually is faced with. I suppose that it more often than not, it's that moment in stories of mine where, not necessarily the character's realization, because the characters don't always realize, when the reader realizes, I think that's important, the acknowledgement, but on the part of the narrative, not necessarily on the part of the character himself.
It's a great story. It's very effective.
Oh, thank you.
And so, Matthew, can I just ask you the same thing then? Just tell us a bit about your story. And
I didn't, when Ra contacted me with regard to this anthology, no, I wasn't familiar with the abject, the theory of the abject. So it was, initially fascinating to kind of, read through the materials that Ra provided. And, immediately I kind of felt it on an emotional level, but had never kind of read anything articulated in that way. So yes, I was delighted to be asked, and I think my story, I suppose, is a little bit. I guess it's kind of similar in that it's about being confronted by a version of yourself that perhaps is no longer that familiar to yourself. I always get pretty horrified when I read old letters that I've written or things like that, where I don't honestly recognize the person that I'm reading, but I kind of can recall where I was, and then I get a kind of very strange emotional distancing, and a kind of vague sense of horror that, oh my gosh, I can, and it's partly, it's not nostalgia at all. It is kind of horror at, oh, that was my head really in that space at that time, and I suppose with this the story that I've written, I'm also haunted, I think, by the idea of doppelgangers, the idea of meeting yourself. And so I suppose I was trying to think of a way that you could kind of combine the idea of meeting yourself, a version of yourself that you've been denying, and a version of yourself that has, I don't want to spoil the ending for anyone who hasn't read it, yet, but it's kind of I suppose it's seeing oneself at the worst possible predicament that they could potentially be in. So it's kind of, and I think it's that horror of not wanting to remember the person you once were, I guess. It's kind of a vague way of saying it, I think.
You've all definitely walked around telling us about your story, and I've read them all, and they're all very, very good without telling us too much. So yeah, I really recommend them all. So just generally to all three of them, really, how useful is it to work in this kind of way? How useful is it to have somebody take theory to you and say, respond to this? Is that sort of, is that stimulating? Is that restricting? How is it sort of creatively?
Oh, it's a discipline, I think. I mean, I actually I wouldn't want to do it all the time, but I actually think that being asked to do something within specific parameters by an editor can be very productive. I mean, in fact, having said this, Ra wasn't that prescriptive, I don't think, to any of us or any of those who were not here either. But I mean, I've certainly had cases where people have specified the length of the story, the setting of the story, and things like, and I certainly wouldn't want to do that very often. But even then, I found the very restrictions are stimulating, and being given this larger theme, I think it's interesting to me actually that the three of us have really treated it rather similarly, haven't we? In all three cases, it's, for a start, it's psychological rather than physical. All right, there's an implication of the physical in all three stories, but at the same time, we've tended to take the character being confronted with something about themselves as absolutely central to the story. I'm afraid well, obviously I've read my own, but Matthew's and Lucie's are the only other two stories I've read so far, and I'm rather intrigued. Andy, perhaps you can say, are other stories quite different from this?
There are, people do take different directions, and I think you could probably draw sort of various links between them. But yeah, I think definitely, as it has happened, that the three of you are all kind of exploring an interesting particular approach to it. Yeah, very much so. So Matthew and Lucie, would you agree with that then? That this is kind of a stimulating way to work?
Yes, I found it. an unusual piece of work to do. I've not really been commissioned to write a story with this level of detail attached to it before. I think just touching on what you've just said, I think the variety of stories in the book show what a broad means of interpretation there is amongst all the writers. There's obviously a really good array of people who've chosen to go for the bodily objection, and people who've gone for the more psychological and societal objection. And I think that's a sign of what a good brief it was, actually. I felt quite, not constrained, but it really took me out of my comfort zone in that I've not really attempted this kind of dystopian fiction before. So for me, it was trying to find a balance between being realistic, but not going too far off the scale so as to make it completely untenable. But it was actually really great working with Ra. He's an excellent editor to work with. He's demanding's probably not kind enough. But he really does make you get the best out of yourself, I found. So for me, it was a real pleasure working with Ra, and I was really, really thrilled to be asked.
Ra's notes are legendary, yes. Matthew, what about you? How was it for you?
I find it a really great way of writing, actually. I suppose for me, because as well, I don't instantly get up each day and write prose, so I sort of do it between other things, and often I kind of need that kick to get going on something anyway. But what I think Ra is particularly good at is, as Lucie said, he kind of, stimulates your thinking to such an extent that, he provides you with an awful lot of information, but never says you have to make it about this or that. Here is the stuff, absorb it at your leisure, and then, if you think there's something brewing there, show me what you've got. And I find, there was no, the kind of the freedom, the time freedom to kind of absorb this stuff, and the way, the directions that just encountering the material that he's brought to you, and it just takes your brain along, paths that you wouldn't necessarily have gone down yourself. I mean, I thought that particularly about Possum as well, because, which was the story I wrote for the previous comic collection, but I find it very helpful to have that brief, because it sort of just puts your brain in a different gear, and you wouldn't have got to that place at all unless it had kind of been offered, this is the road I want you to go down, see what you find. So yes, I find it a really great experience, actually.
That's interesting, because particularly in the case of Possum, as you say, that kind of came out of you being given a brief like this, but you really ran with that because it ended up kind of taking different forms. So clearly that did spark something off, didn't it?
Yeah.
So there was a quote which I saw online, which I saw a couple of weeks ago. It kind of did their rounds on Twitter, by Joe Hill, son of Stephen King, and obviously a very successful writer in his own right. And it just struck me as quite interesting, and I think possibly quite relevant to this project. So Joe Hill had said, effective horror isn't about sadism, it's about extreme empathy. Do you think that's, what would you make of that? Is that your experience, and is that your experience of writing particularly for this collection?
Yes, I mean, not specifically for this collection, but yes, I think so. I think not least in terms of getting inside the head of characters we might ordinarily, cross the street to avoid at the very least, is something that I find myself often tending to do. I mean, I think my character in this particular story is more is a grey area, really, like most of us perhaps. But it's its attitude to that rejected aspect of himself that's important. That is actually the dark side of himself in that precise way. So sure, yeah, yes, empathy, but empathy in the particular case of the story, I suppose, is at one remove, put it that way, yeah.
And I suppose there is an implication in the quote as well that it's a mistake people make. People think that horror is about horrible things happening to people, but which on one level, of course, it can be, but there is also, it's not as superficial as it might seem, perhaps.
Oh gosh, I think that's certainly true. Yeah.
And Matthew, Lucie, does that kind of mean anything to you about the extreme empathy? Was that something that?
I think on a very basic level, there needs to be some element of empathy in a horror story in order for the reader to feel something, and in order to project those feelings onto the characters. There's always an element of suffering in horror fiction, and if there's no corresponding empathy, then I kind of think, what's the point? And I think with hindsight, in my story, called Wretched, I think there is quite a lot of empathy with the protagonist, who's put in quite a tricky moral dilemma at the end. So, and I don't think that's something I'd actually had at the front of my mind when I was writing it. So it's, yeah, that's an interesting quote to pick up. Yeah.
Matthew, in view, was that?
I mean, I agree. I think there's room for everything, actually. You know, I mean, I naturally gravitate towards stories that move me, I think, and I've, you know, my favorite horror stories are probably ones that really do focus on the empathy side of things. But at the same time, I think it's important to be able to get inside the head of someone who's not, you know, necessarily a character we like. And I think some of my favorite, you know, horror stories and horror novels are ones that kind of take you inside the head of someone very dangerous. I mean, I'm thinking of people like, you know, Robert Bloch and Charles Wilford, and I think there's a slight tendency these days that we want perhaps to have our fiction as, you know, representing the world as we would like to have it, rather than representing the world as it is. And I think that's a big mistake that's made, because you can have very good, effective horror fiction that is, you know, potentially not palatable and not and takes you to places that make you feel very uncomfortable. And I think personally, I think that's what horror should do. And I worry getting, you know, into the area of kind of safe horror that sort of just reinforces how we want things to be ultimately, and the kind of the happy endings that seem to come in. I'm less interested in that. I think I don't mind it being very bleak and very upsetting. I kind of think empathy comes from that anyway, I think, because it's very much how you react to that material, how, you know, your moral compass kicks in with the material that you're reading. And I think that you can afford to take the reader to places that they find very uncomfortable, as long as it's done well. I'm not a huge fan of, you know, just nasty stuff, you know, for the sake of it. But I don't think you can't have a character that is incapable of the nastiest, is not capable of the nastiest things, and still write a very good story about them. Yeah, so I kind of like it a bit, you know, a bit unpleasant at times.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I won't do is try and make a character sympathetic if I don't find them sympathetic. I mean, what I think is important is to depict them honestly, you know, accurately. And so perhaps empathy isn't necessarily the issue for me. I mean, there is a sense in which, you know, I'm very much opposed to the kind of writing that is effectively a means of the writer saying, this character has nothing to do with me, you know, and using all their technique to declare their separateness from the character. Because obviously all the characters, in a sense, come from within ourselves. Even if we're, you know, observing other people and basing characters on them, we're still, in a sense, inhabiting that character to the extent that we write about them at all. And I guess I think of it, you know, an early novel of mine, The Face That Must Die. I mean, John Horridge in there is, well, we inhabit the inside of his head for a good deal of that novel. And to me, actually, the horror of the novel is not merely what he does, although he's convinced, you know, he's right in his actions. But in fact, I think the horror is what it's like to be him every second of every day. That's what I was kind of trying to convey. And to make him more sympathetic, I think would have been very dishonest. I mean, David Morrell, you know, he of First Blood and so forth, it tells an anecdote. I don't think this novel has ever actually appeared, because I think he was so disconcerted or dismayed by the reaction of an editor that he never completed it. But basically, the central character, as I remember the way David tells it, is a wife abuser, basically, and the story is told from his viewpoint. And he showed, I think, about 50 pages of this to, I think, an editor, maybe not an agent, who said, well, can't you make the character more sympathetic? And David said, well, no, that's the point. You know, he's not sympathetic. He would quite understand that he felt very, very bad about making the character, you know, softening the character, if you like. Yeah. I think that there is this, there is a sort of demand on the part of some readers for characters that they want to identify with. And I really don't think that needs to be the point about horror at all.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. I wanted to ask a little bit about, I'm fascinated by this idea of, within the Abject, this idea of revulsion. And obviously there was, in terms of the brief, there was this possibility to explore more body horror, which isn't necessarily what you've done, but I was just interested in this idea that when we watch a horror film, when we see something, that revulsion is a really immediate thing. Can horror prose fiction do different things? Can it explore that kind of revulsion in a slightly different way, just purely by dint of the fact that you're not seeing it and responding to it in that same way?
Well, I mean, the prose can certainly treat it differently, can't it? I mean, you can have lyrical body horror. I mean, well, an obvious example, Clive Barker, I would have thought, the Books of Blood in particular, where the prose makes it more, you know, I won't say glamorous exactly, but certainly more wondrous, if you like. And, you know, where a different writer would describe exactly the same thing and make it simply disgusting. And I think, you know, the lyrical impulse in that does tend to be mainly a prose thing. But on the other hand, there's also the kind of, if you like, confrontational body horror. Now, Clive's work is obviously part of that, or some of Clive's work is part of that. But I also think of somebody like David Cronenberg, where I don't think Cronenberg's point in a film like, say, Shivers, you know, or Rabid, say, or Videodrome, is particularly to disgust the audience. It's to confront us, to make us look at these things and decide for ourselves how we respond. I tend not to find Cronenberg's films horrific in the usual sense. It's more a matter of, it's not quite embracing the horror, but it's certainly making us look again at it.
So Lucy, Matthew, does that mean anything to you? Does it?
Yeah, I think in terms of written body horror, so the way a lot of people in the new Abject have approached it, it's possible to be a lot more nuanced about it. Whereas when it's presented on screen, you are given something, and how you digest it as a viewer is possibly less intricate than how you would digest it as a reader, where I think you bring more of your own readings to it. So if you're presented with a pus-filled scar on screen, I think your reaction is going to be slightly more basic, one of revulsion and disgust, than if there is a very lyrical description of that within a piece of prose that would probably, I would imagine, ask you to draw more on your own experiences. So you would possibly think back to your past, whether you've encountered any of disgusting sores like this, rather than just being presented with something and asked to take it on face value. So,
Matthew, yourself, does that?
I mean, I think, I mean, some of the stories at the front of the new Abject did this so well. I think it's almost the surprise element. It's the sudden confrontation with the difference in context with which you're discovering this physical, disgust, this abject horror. And I think, it depends. There are films. Cronenberg does this brilliantly. They're kind of the way the horror presents itself, it feels like it's always in contrast to a set of expectations you've already established in your head going into it. And I think it's that surprise element that you are shocked, you are suddenly confronted with something where your mind is suddenly confronted with a thing that it wasn't prepared for at that particular point in time. And I think that films can do this in a certain way. I think if films are just going for, you know, all out splatter and wanting to gross you out, I don't think that's the same thing. I think that you know, I think that is purely just gore, and I wouldn't say that that is, for me, the Abject. It's, you know, it's very much for me about being surprised when it turns up, and feeling absolutely horrified because your mind's in another place, and it's when it's suddenly confronted with this thing, and it's a surprise to your you know, your mind and your expectation. I think that's where that effect is most powerful.
Right, we're just over halfway through, so if anybody's got any questions lined up, feel free to pop them in the chat. There is one question that's so kind of inevitable that I'm going to ask it, and I'll be the fool who asks it, which is that obviously, given the year that we've had, how can horror respond to the pandemic? Are people going to be more interested in reading horror, less interested in reading horror? Have you yourselves maybe been sort of minded to read horror, or less, or not so much within the past few months? How's it going to play?
Well, it hasn't really changed my reading habits at all, but then, you know, I read pretty widely and watch movies very widely, actually. So nothing has changed on that level. I really ask myself the same question about Andy, because I mean, you know, as you mentioned, this novel came out of mine, The Wise Friend, came out in April, and of course it actually came out toward the end of April. Originally, we were going to tour around with it. Of course, we couldn't do any of that. There was a certain amount of online coverage and promotion and so forth, which, you know, was very much like this meeting we're having right now. But I must admit, I was a bit wary of, you know, do people want to read this kind of fiction under these circumstances? I was amazed by how positive the reaction has been. It would appear that yes, people do. I suppose that is a novel, particularly that deals with the uncanny. I mean, I don't go much for, you know, very much for physical horror in most of my stuff, and I've tended to do so, perhaps less so in recent years. You know, there's virtually, I think it's supernatural and uncanny in The Wise Friend, rather than, you know, graphic physical. I mean, people die, yes, but they tend to die off the page, as it were. You know, the reports of their death rather than, you know, graphic description. But no, it genuinely seems that the sense of the uncanny, at least, is something people are looking for at the moment. Well, you know, to the extent that people praise this novel of mine, and other, if I hadn't said other novels, I'm going on too much about myself here. But equally, well, here's a case now, an unnervingly prescient novel, which I commend to all, is Paul Tremblay's Survivor Song. Now, you know, he wrote that last year, but, you know, it reads as if he wrote it last week. It's very, very, very precisely concerned with the sort of experience we're going through now, or, well, actually, the sort of experience we hope this will not lead to. But you know, it's about the central character who's trying to get her friend, who is imminently giving birth, to a hospital in the midst of a pandemic.
Okay.
But no, he genuinely didn't know that this was going to happen, although he had a sort of general sense a couple of years ago that this sort of thing could happen. And certainly people, I think, certainly should be finding a great deal of that novel, because I certainly did. But it's garnering a considerable amount of positive response and praise. So yeah, I think, you know, people still want the fiction, and partly because it reflects experience, as well as partly because it reflects something beyond present experience.
I suppose it's that question, isn't it? What do you want your fiction to do? Do you want your fiction to as an escape? Do you want your fiction to explore things that are already there in your mind? It's going to be interesting to see, I think.
Yeah, I did read a theory that people turn to fiction into horror fiction in dark times because it's almost a safe place to go. There's a foreseeable end to it. You know, it's you finish reading the story, you finish watching the film, and it's over, and then you return to normal life. I don't know if I really subscribe to that. I think it's quite a convenient theory, but in terms of my own reading habits, I've been, I think, reading as much as, if not more, horror than prior to the pandemic. In terms of writing practice, I found it very difficult to confront the pandemic in my own writing, knowing when to include it, whether to just ignore it and hope it goes away. Luckily, what I'm working on at the moment is set in the 1960s, so it's not a problem, but there's going to come a time where that's finished and I'm moving on to the next thing, and I have to decide then how and what exactly do I address, and that's, I think there's quite a lot of decisions to be made there.
Matthew, yourself, have you been reading?
I mean, I think in terms of reading habits, I think I've probably read quite widely as well. I think when it first kicked in, I was very much not in the mood for horror films and not in the mood for reading horror, and that's kind of, you know, worn off, and now I'm fully immersed in horror films and horror books again. But you know, I tell you, I read when I read that Nipper Read had died, I had his autobiography on the shelf, and I thought now's the time to read that, because he died of COVID, and thoroughly just enjoyed reading about someone who'd been up in, you know, against different but very, you know, palpable horror of another kind, and there was something about reading just his resilience and his quiet calm, and, you know, not letting things get on top of him and slowly going forward, and that I found very comforting, you know. And it was very sad that he died, but it was just, you know, I was pleased that I'd taken his book off the shelf and read it in a way, and I found that very comforting, actually. It was like almost like hearing just a very calm voice, you know, reassuring voice taking you through, you know, dark times.
I must admit, for my part, I've definitely had the thing of sitting of an evening thinking, there are various films I want to watch. One of them's a horror film. Do I watch that one? No, not today. but that's just me. Right, I'm just looking in the chat here. We do have a few questions. One short one from Gaynor Jones to Lucy. Is that a real stuffed bird behind you?
It's not, I'm afraid, Gaynor. Sorry to disappoint you. It's a plastic one I bought in Waitrose last Halloween. So sorry.
That's a disappointment. Gaynor asks another longer question. I was in a discussion about writing horror today, and somebody suggested that horror writers have to be much more emotionally vulnerable on the page than writers of other genres. Does that feel true in your experiences?
No.
Any other thoughts?
In my story in particular for this anthology, only in terms of it, as well as being a horror story, it's a little bit of a love story as well. And that to me was completely anathema to what I usually write. So in terms of being emotionally honest, I think that's as close as I've got.
Matthew, you agree with that?
No, I mean, I don't. I think maybe when you're in the stage where you're thinking up the story, perhaps that's the case. But I think it varies, actually. It just varies from story to story and from project to project. Certainly, you know, when making, I found writing, for example, Possum, when I wrote that, the film, that was quite a grueling emotional experience writing that. But as soon as it was written, it was the directing of it was, I didn't feel emotionally about it at all. So I think, you know, I think it's true. It depends what it is, I suppose. And yeah, I think it, but I don't think horror especially. I think that, you know, any other mode or genre of writing has as much, I think, claim to needing you know, emotional resonance. I don't think horror is necessarily demanding more of it than any other.
No, I mean, I think my response was a bit too brusque, wasn't it, really?
You seem very adamant there, Ramsey.
Yeah, but I would just agree with what Matthew just said, really. I mean, surely not. I mean, for instance, tragedy surely must require at least as much emotional vulnerability, you know, on the part of the creator as horror, I would have said. For instance.
We have another question here from Louise Palmer. What is the most horrifying story you've ever read? Any thoughts?
Oh, so I was hoping somebody else would go first.
It looks like you're all sort of relaying all these horrible reading experiences you've had, as though you're having flashbacks.
Yes. Lordy. Well, one that immediately comes to mind is a story by the late and much lamented Brian Aldiss called Horse Meat, which was published in Interzone. I think it was Interzone in those days before it split into two magazines. It became Black Static spun off from it. Brian wrote it, I believe I'm right in saying this, I'm right in saying this actually, I think immediately after his wife's death, that it was basically a sort of scream of horror at the world in a way. I mean, it reminded me a little bit of Leonid Andreev's story, The Abyss. It has something rather similar, but Brown's story is a whole lot more explicit and pushes the very edge, I think, of what was actually publishable. I mean, I found it extremely disturbing and powerful. And Steve Jones and I, who were then co-editing Best New Horror, I mean, I was in favour of using it. Steve was not. So, and unless we agreed on a story, we didn't include it. So we didn't include it. But I would have liked to see it in there. But who knows whether Brian would still want it to be reprinted? I have no idea. But it deeply disturbed me, that story. And I would certainly describe it as one of the most horrifying stories that I've read.
Lucy, do you have one?
Yeah, at the risk of sounding like I'm taking an easy option, I read Possum again this morning, and it's really horrendous. So well done, Matthew. Also,
the film.
And another couple that spring to mind are there's a story by Nicholas Royal called This Video Does Not Exist, and that is about someone doing some deep dives into videos of beheadings in the Islamic State, and that really left me reeling. And on a completely different level, there's a story by Stephen Volk called Arslicker, I think it's called, and that kind of speaks to itself. If I say that it is contains a lot of the idea of the abject, that in terms of being horrifying, it's yeah, pretty nasty.
Okay. Matthew?
I can't remember the name of this story, but I'm sure Ramsey will know. It's a Thomas Ligotti story, and it's the one where he's woken up at night and he's told to swallow a pill, and
oh Lord, no!
And it might be. Do you remember that? And there's some, and the implication is that there's now something growing inside him about to come out.
Damn it! No, I without going to look it up, I can't. But we say go and read Thomas Ligotti, I think, don't we?
Yeah.
Everybody, just go and do it, yeah. And you'll find that story eventually, but by then your head will be in a very strange state anyway, even before you find that particular one.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's another question here from Catherine Cavendish. As horror authors, are there any topics you would never go near?
I mean, there are certain topics, but this is more because I don't think I have anything to bring to them. So, I don't think I would not write about the Holocaust, because I mean, I think that other writers have know far more about it, either from experience or from, empathy of various kinds. And I don't actually genuinely feel that I've got anything to bring to the theme. It's odd because I did once write a story called A Street Was Chosen, which is a report of an unspecified experiment on a street full of people, basically. It's told entirely in the passive voice, and the characters are not given names, they're simply given letters and numbers. And in a sense, that is a story about the utter dehumanization of victims and the way that they're perceived as being just subjects without any humanity to them. In a sense, I would say that's as close as I ever came to writing about that theme. So to that extent, I wrote about it. The other thing I would say is, for a long time, I thought I would never write about child abuse. But in fact, I've just written a story about a survivor of child abuse. It's a novel that will be out of mine next year. But because I felt I could do it legitimately, I wrote it. Up to that point, I didn't, and so it's in a sense, it's the living through the imaginative experience that makes me decide, yes, I can write about this theme. If it's a sort of moral act of create, the actual act of writing is in itself a moral act, and I think, I hope in this case, yes, it has been.
Matthew, are there subjects that you wouldn't go near?
I kind of agree with Ramsey. I think if certain subjects, and the one that Ramsey referred to there, something like the Holocaust. Yes, I don't think that it just, there's no way I could write about anything like that. I think it's, if you feel you can write about it, I kind of think you just need to follow your instinct, and you're always, I think, deciding what is the right thing to write and what isn't. At the same time, I think you can afford to push things a bit for yourself, and I don't think there's anything wrong in kind of writing stuff that is perhaps uncomfortable, but I think it has at some level, some emotional level, has to come from personal experience, I think, or I think that applies to all writing in a way. I think the best writing always seems to come from a kind of emotional or psychological space that at some level you're familiar with, and that's how stories and books come alive for the reader. And I think you can tell pretty quickly when someone is just writing about something that they've got no emotional connection with at all.
Lucy,
I agree completely with that. My initial reaction to the question was to think, well, no, there's nothing I wouldn't attempt, but I think I'd agree with both Ramsey and Matthew there, saying there are some subjects that are either better off dealt with by other people, or for example, in the case of child abuse, I just don't see why I'd want to write about that. I'd find that too difficult. But having said that, my novel deals with themes of infanticide and cruelty to animals, so both of which are, being a mother and an animal lover, are very, very triggering things for me. And I think, like Matthew said, if you write about things that are emotionally relevant to yourself, you're more likely to do a better and possibly more sensitive job of it.
Another question here from Becca Parkinson, specifically for Matt. When you wrote Possum, did you know that you wanted to turn it into a film, or did you write it with adaptation in mind? And did you take a similar approach with your story for The Abject?
The answer to that is no. I didn't think of filming Possum at all when I wrote it. It was a long time afterwards that I was really reaching around trying to find a suitable kind of narrative to turn into a horror film, and that one felt just felt like it would be interesting to try and turn Possum into a film. And likewise with this, I mean, I don't think this is, in a sense, it's on a far smaller scale than even Possum is, and Possum is a short story anyway. And I don't think this one, I don't think it would be filmable. I think it's probably far more unpleasant than Possum, actually, and it would kind of be box office poison, I think. But no, I don't think about that at that stage. No.
But am I right in saying, though, if anybody's interested, that you are working on another film?
Oh, God, yeah. Oh, sorry. No, sorry. I thought you said if anyone wants to make. Yeah, no, I'm open.
Well, I thought you were just being confident there.
No, I'll hawk it. I'll hawk whatever I've got here. No, sorry. I'll let you finish the question.
I believe that you are working on another film, though, for anybody who's interested.
I am. Yes. Hopefully, things have been delayed as everything else by COVID, but hopefully sometime next year. I'll be making another one, I hope.
Okay. So another question here from Matthew. Are you feeling positive about the current health of independent publishers and the authors they represent? COVID has clearly had an impact, but the UK seems to be in fairly rude health with lots of support. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think so. And I mean, here's the PS Publishing for a start. I mean, Flame Tree, I think, are too big now to be discovered as an independent publisher, particularly since they've got Simon & Schuster on their side. But they certainly started out that way, and but they seem to be, going from, well, cliche, this isn't it, strength to strength, but that does seem to be what's happening. And yes, I think there's a lot of vitality about, and not least in this field. So more power to it and them.
Lucie, Matthew, is that your experience of independent publishers?
Yes, my debut novel was published by Dead Ink, who are a Liverpool-based independent publisher, and they're also bringing out my short story collection next year. And it's been absolutely brilliant working with them. I mean, it's I've not worked with a traditional publisher, so I have nothing to compare it with, but I've enjoyed the whole process enormously. I think the situation at the moment, I'm confident about the future for independent publishing, but slightly trepidatious because it is a very precarious time for them. They don't have the shareholders to back them up. They don't have the enormous coffers. So I think now is a really good time for people to be buying books from independent publishers.
Is it the case, though, that smaller independent publishers can take more risks and can do the more interesting things?
I think they can. I think they can take more risks with writers and publish new voices and books that aren't necessarily part of a trend. But that comes with its own costs and threats. They don't have the guaranteed income from riding the wave of a particular trend. So they do take risks, which is brilliant, but they obviously, that puts them in a slightly more difficult position sometimes.
Matthew, how about yourself?
Well, I mean, I don't have a huge amount of experience in that I've only really published with Comma, but I have done a few, just a couple of pieces for Swan River Press, who specialise in republishing rare Sheridan Le Fanu works and lots of other interesting writers. And what's fantastic about them and Brian, who is the chap in charge, is that the books are so beautifully produced, and they are real. Just fantastic things to hold and have on your shelf. And I think that very often it's the small independent publishers that, very often there are books that would look fantastic on any shelf in any bookstore in the country. They are just so well made. And I don't know if anyone else has this experience, but increasingly buying from the big shops and that, the books just don't seem to be in that great condition, really. The quality of things, and I think there's places like Swan River, they really do kind of produce works that are very good value for money, because and that's just speaking from someone who likes books and likes picking up a book and holding it in your hands and reading it. And this that's really all my experience of it, to be, as I say, because I'm not a prolific short story writer.
Matthew, who asked that question, has also said, also loved Matthew in Dark Place, Man to Man with Dean Lerner and Blind Manor, which now makes me suspect that you are actually just sending messages to you, praising yourself. You can tell us if this is the case. Okay, well, we have a few more minutes if anybody has any more questions. I think we've covered everything in the chat there. Was that? Let me just see. Yeah, somebody has asked if the most horrifying story possible is the American election coverage, which obviously, yeah, we've all been there. Okay, well, if no more questions, I will leave it there then. So yeah, the new Abject available now from Comma Press. Also the new Uncanny and Phobic, their previous modern horror collections, have been repackaged and republished. So feel free to buy those too. So yeah, if you'd just like to show your appreciation, maybe in the chat there for our guests, and yeah, thank you for attending this evening.